Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. This is a bonus review that's out of schedule with the normal releases, and it's thanks to StereoNet Australian member Bengineer. I was chatting to Bengineer via private messenger, and he mentioned that he had the unique Melody Mest Mk2 IEM and also the UA12 from 64 Audio. He was trying to compare the two to see which he preferred, and jokingly I said did he want a second opinion because I already owned the U12T. Bengineer, whose name is Ben, was kind enough to send the Mest Mk2, that's the Mark II version, down to me to try up against my U12Ts for another opinion and also to share with you. So I want to say a huge thanks to Ben for making this review possible. It's going to be a slightly quicker review than usual potentially, and there are no measurements, partly because of the quick turnaround time, but also because with the bone conduction that these use, as I'll talk about shortly, I'm not sure how it translates to measurements, and I didn't have time to fiddle around and find out. So it might be a slightly shorter review than usual, but hopefully very useful as I talk about the merits, the pros, the cons, etc. of the unique Melody Mest Mk2 and also compare it to the 64 Audio U12T, which to this day I think are the best IEM I've ever heard. For now though, let's take a quick look at the unique Melody Mest Mk2. The unique Melody Mest Mk2s retail for $14.99 US, which translates to roughly 2,000 Australian dollars. They're a big departure from my first ever set of customs that I happen to own, which was a pair of unique Melody Miracles. Those were a multi-balanced armature design, not that dissimilar to anything that's followed since, but the Mest Mk2 have a completely different approach to producing sound. These are what unique Melody are calling a quadbrid design, and that means they're using 4 different driver types inside each shell. Those driver types are a dynamic driver for bass, a bone conduction driver to create the sense of vibration through the head and also add a little bit of extra bass through the bone conduction and into the inner ear. They also use balanced armatures for the mid-range and treble details, and top it all off with an electrostatic driver for the very high frequency extension. So it's a real mishmash of driver technologies that might be magical or it might cause problems, and that's what I was interested to know. Before I talk about the sound, I just want to talk about the design, the features, the fit, all of those bits and pieces that come before you ever get to turn them on. I don't have the original box here on the desk to show you, but you'll see it in the glamour video. But that said, it's also nothing special. What I think is really good though and worth mentioning is the carry case that it comes with. So the Mest carry case is large. It's not quite a hard case, but it's definitely hard enough. And it's got plenty of space on the inside for a nicely, easily, loosely coiled up cable to sit in there. And if you want to protect the individual drivers, there's a separate little space for each of those drivers. And by drivers, I mean the shells themselves. So it's a great case. It does put to shame a little bit, I think, what comes with the 64 Audio U12T that I feel like is a fairly basic case and a little bit tight in the sense that it may lead to the ear shells rubbing together and maybe damaging one another. So I really like the unique Melody case and I wanted to call that out. There's also a fantastic range of tips available for the unique Melody Mest, and I think that's fantastic as well. At this level of performance, you're likely going to want a tip roll to get the sound and the fit just right. So when brands like unique Melody and 64 Audio provide you with lots of different tip choices, I think it's a real bonus. The final thing I want to mention about in terms of design and accessories before I get to the actual earphones themselves is the cable. This cable is beautifully made. Again, I think it does put to shame a little bit what comes with the 64 Audio IEMs. Not that it's bad what comes with those, but this is exceptional. It's a really beautiful high quality cable. It's got nice Y splitter terminations and also the headphone jack terminations that I believe can come in 2.5, 3.5 or the 4.4mm like I've got here from Ben, and it's really just a beautiful cable. I think I recall Ben saying, and forgive me that I haven't done as much research for this review as usual, but I think I recall Ben saying that this may have come from one of the major aftermarket cable manufacturers, and that probably explains the quality level. It's a beautiful cable, it's supple, it's thick but not heavy, it just is perfect and easy to work with. So it's a huge bonus that you get this level of cable, but also something that I think should be expected when you're spending this much money on an IEM. So now let's talk about the IEMs themselves. I'm going to take them off the cable so I'm not waving the cable around. These use a 2-pin connector, which is pretty standard for most IEMs at this level, it seems. Some of them do go MMCX, but I think I'm finding 2-pin more common with all those that I've tried. It's an acrylic style shell. It's in that sort of pseudo custom shape where it's going to fit everyone's ears because of the nozzle on the end, but otherwise it's molded to fit fairly comfortably inside the concha of the ear. Now, my only issue with these in terms of fit is I do find the nozzle just a little bit thick. I don't have the largest ear canals, and so anything with a nozzle that's getting up to this sort of size can be a little bit troublesome. The good thing is with all of the tip options provided, I was able to get a really good fit and seal. My only concern is I may not have had it as deep as I'd want it to be in order to get the acrylic shell in good contact with my ear. You see, the benefit of having good contact with your ear is that with the bone conduction drivers that the Mest Mk2s use, and the original Mest did this as well, with those bone conduction drivers, you actually need the earphone to touch your ear in order to convey the vibrations through the skin into the bone and into the ear. If you're not getting good surface area in contact, you're not necessarily going to get the level of vibration you want. Obviously, you'll get some through the tip of the earphone, but that's also isolated by the fact that you are using silicone or foam, which is not going to translate the vibrations cleanly from the earphone into your ear. So you do want that hard acrylic touching your ear in some spots. Now, as I'll talk about shortly, I don't know if that's the cause for what I heard. The bone conduction certainly was working well for me, but it wasn't always consistent. And that may also be due to the way they've designed and tuned the bone conduction. And I don't know what the limitations of bone conduction are, so maybe this is the best it gets. I don't know if it's a decision that Unique Melody made or if it's just the way it is and they physically couldn't make it extend any further. But the bone conduction drivers work from 500 Hz all the way up to 20 kHz. The problem with that is it means there's this big gulf between 500 Hz and 20 Hz where you're not getting any of that vibration. The problem with that is if you've ever been standing in front of a loudspeaker or if you're in the audience at a concert in front of live music, what you'll know is that you tend to feel the lower frequencies more than the high frequencies. And that's what that bone conduction should be doing, is giving us the benefits of the vibration and the impact and the feel of the low frequencies. At least that's how I understand it. So for me, that gap between 50 and 20 Hz seems like a bit of a problem, and as I'll talk about shortly, it does play out a bit that way from a listening and subjective experience. Before I dive into sound quality, I do want to flag that I think these are a beautifully made IEM. They stack up to all the expectations I would have unboxing something in that $1,500 range. The packaging is great, the carry case is great, the cable is outstanding, the tip choice is excellent, and the earphones themselves look and feel very, very well made. So there's nothing really left wanting in terms of the design, the accessories, the build quality, all of that's top notch. So it all then comes down to sound quality. The sound from the UM Mest Mk2 for me is a little bit gimmicky. I don't mean that it's trashy or bad overall. What I mean is that I think it's trying just a little bit too hard to be a little bit too special. I think the combination of all four drivers is probably bringing it undone just a little bit. It does some things amazingly well, as I'll talk about in just a second, but at the same time, those things aren't consistent, and so it draws your attention to the fact that it's not doing it consistently and well for all music and all genres. To break that down a little bit, let's step through some of the frequency range. The first thing I want to mention is the treble from the Mest Mk2 is absolutely outstanding in terms of its general quality, but I think it's just a little bit overdone. I think the use of the electrostatic driver might be just separating a little bit too much of the sound from the rest of the kind of blob of music that you're hearing, and I'll explain that more in a minute. And at the same time, I think it's overemphasizing by producing too much treble extension. It produces unnatural tonalities at times, and that reminds me that I'm I'm listening to a set of earphones and prevents me just getting lost in the music. I'll provide some more specific examples of that track by track in a moment, but let's first talk a bit more about what that means for the overall sound presentation. That extra treble information has the effect of producing a greater sense of space in the soundstage in much the same way the HD800 and HD800S do with their treble peaks. That's not to say that soundstage is all about treble, but it can help to produce a greater sense of spaciousness when that extra treble is there. Within that soundstage, all that extra treble detail also helps us to really tightly focus the image, but, and this is where the problems start to happen, it also breaks the image apart too much. And what I mean by that is that when listening to the Mest Mk2, I found that certain sounds were almost separated from one another. And a great example I'll talk about shortly is a mandolin strum in a Norah Jones track that until I look at my notes I don't remember the name of, but in that particular track that I'll talk about soon, it's like the texture of the string was here and the vibration and the harmonics of the string was here in the soundstage. They weren't combined as one single thing. And I'm assuming that's because of the different drivers handling different sections of the frequency range of each of those individual sounds. So for me, it's not always a good experience listening to the Mest Mk2. When things land properly, they're quite magical, but sometimes they just draw your attention to the fact that there's an incoherency going on between all of the different parts trying to work together in the Mest Mk2. Another example of that inconsistency is with the bone conduction drivers, as I've already mentioned. What I found as I listened to these is that the bone conduction would come and go. Sometimes I was feeling the bass, sometimes I wasn't. And it would happen sometimes in the one same track. It wouldn't worry me so much if it was down to the mastering of a track and therefore on some tracks you heard it and on some tracks you didn't, because different tracks are more or less bassy. The problem for me was a single bass guitar moving up and down through notes would sometimes vibrate and sometimes not, and again it's a distraction from music. I want to be able to put these earphones in, listen to them, and just enjoy them. Instead, what I found was I was listening to them and going, oh, they're working well here, oh, they're not working well there. And that's not just when I was listening critically, that's when I just had them in with the aim to just enjoy the music. They prevented me from doing so. So for me, it's a big drawback on these, but it's not all lost. I want to talk about what these sound like when things are done well, because they are spectacular. But I also want to talk about what these sound like when things aren't done well, because whilst they're not bad, they just miss out on what I expect for a $1,500 earphone. So let's talk now about 3 particular tracks that I listened to with the Mest Mk2, and at the end of that I'm going to talk about those same 3 tracks on the 64 Audio U12T and why I preferred one or the other on each of those tracks. Kicking things off, we've got Groove Me by King Floyd. This is not a particularly well recorded track, it's quite harsh in the treble, and that caused some problems when listening with the Mest Mk2. The vocals were incredibly well focused from the Mest Mk2 because of both the recording and the way it's been set up, but also the extra treble information from the Mk2s. The problem is I couldn't really enjoy that imaging because the treble is just too hot in combination between the recording and the Mest Mk2. The recording itself has treble that's a bit dry and a bit harsh and probably just a little bit too forward. And then the Mest Mk2 just take all of that and up it because of their starting emphasis on treble through the electrostatic drivers and also possibly through the balanced armatures. It's hard to separate where one starts and one stops in terms of where the qualities of the sound are coming from, and therefore I don't know which one's causing the harshness. The other problem I noticed on this track, and it's what I was referring to earlier with the bone conduction, is that with the bass guitar, this being a bit of a funk track, the bass guitar stepping through and walking through a bass line, what I found was that sometimes I would both hear and feel the bass guitar, and other times I would only hear it. So it's a bit of a problem for me that on the one track, depending on which note the bass guitar was hitting, I was or was not feeling it. And again, it just breaks the immersion in listening to the music. So as I mentioned before, we'll come back around shortly and talk about how the U12T handles these tracks, but let me continue to paint the picture of the Mest Mk2 first by moving on to Sinking Soon by Norah Jones. On this track, in isolation, if you listen to each individual part of the track, it sounds fantastic. Everything's really interestingly etched out, and I mean etched not in a harsh way, but kind of clearly defined within the soundstage. There's lots of amazing, beautiful sounds going on. But the problem is, they're all wonderful in isolation. They don't mesh together into a coherent whole. This was the track I mentioned before where I think it's a mandolin which is strumming on the right-hand side of the soundstage, and it's like there are 2 different instruments being played. One of them is the textures of the strings being strummed. The other is the actual resonance and richness of the strings vibrating. The problem is those two things should be absolutely inextricably linked because they're all part of the same musical performance. Instead, what happens is it sounded like the strumming was happening here and the resonance and richness was happening here. More to the point, the textures were louder and overemphasized compared to that harmonic resonance. So for me, it really pulled apart that mandolin and it made it sound foreign and alien because a part of me knew it was a real instrument, but it didn't sound like the real instrument. So that was a real drawback and a shame because everything else sounded so perfect when considered in isolation. The bone conduction driver on this track did also come and go a little bit, but I don't know, in this case it was much more subtle, so it might have been the limitations of my sensitivity to the vibrations, so how well my skin was actually picking up the vibrations versus the actual conduction driver coming and going in terms of what it was producing. I'm not sure on that one. The final track I moved on to was Barefoot Bride by the Bad Loves. Again, not a wonderfully recorded track, but a good enough recording given that it's a bit of a thicker recording with some more instrumentation going on and just generally the sort of stuff that's likely to come up in a lot of people's collections. The first thing I thought as I listened to it was why on earth was the hi-hat above the singer and in front of the singer, or at least level with the singer? It made no sense to me. And I'll talk more about that with the U12T, but it was really made obvious by the Mest Mk2. Not only was the hi-hat sitting way high and off to the left and level with the singer, but so was the snare. It was like the singer was the drum player, and I know for a fact that he's not. So the placement of sound in this particular recording, and therefore coming from the Mest Mk2, was all over the shop. Now, as I'll talk about shortly, the placement of sounds in the actual production of this track is not great, but the Mest Mk2 took that and once again over-amplified it and made it even worse. I also found that the bass output coming from the Mest Mk2 was a little bit hit and miss on this track. Things are a bit slow and a bit thick, which is the recording, but it was coming and going a little bit, so sometimes it would get more prominent and then less prominent, which once again I think is the bone conduction driver delivering or not delivering vibrations in line with the bass, depending on the frequencies. So as you can hear, there are lots of technically excellent pieces going on within the Mest Mk2, but the overall result to me is very hit and miss. Now, there are tracks that when I was listening to these just to get familiar with them sounded absolutely magical on the Mest Mk2. I can't call them out right now because, as I said, it was when I was listening from a general point of view and not taking notes. As it happened, when I sat down to take notes, all of the 3 tracks that I specifically listened to for note-taking happened to have problems. And indeed, I think with the Mest Mk2, every single track does have slight problems. It's just that sometimes they're less likely to cause a disengagement with the music, depending on the type of music you're listening to. So let's put all of this into context now by talking about those same tracks with the 64 Audio U12T. Working backwards from Barefoot Bride, what I noticed was that when I used the 64 Audio U12T, the same problems with the soundstage instrument placement were evident, but they weren't overblown. I found that I could still tell that the snare and the hi-hat were in slightly strange places, but they weren't overemphasized in the mix. And again, that's because the treble from the Mest Mk2 is slightly overdone, and it drew my attention to those higher frequency focused instruments. So the snare and the hi-hat both have quite a lot of high frequency content, and therefore the Mest Mk2 made them more prominent in the mix. In the U12T, it's much better balanced with everything else, and so whilst they're still poorly placed in the original recording, they're not pushed forward in the mix by the earphones and made to be a big problem. With the U12T, the bass on Barefoot Bride was still thick and muddy and not particularly well controlled within the recording, but it was more consistently that way. It didn't come and go in quite the same way it did with the Mest Mk2 because, again, we don't have different drivers trying to do different parts of the frequency range. We've got a consistent, multi-balanced armature approach that therefore delivers consistent tonality and texture and timbral quality and also levels of output across the frequency range. It's interesting to me that it's often the mediocre type recordings that reveal some of the shortcomings in earphones. Most earphones and headphones will sound fantastic with a magnificently recorded track, but it's interesting that when you throw them recordings that are more everyday, basic production, not those kind of audiophile level recordings, that's where you often start to see the flaws. And indeed, that's what I found when comparing these two. The Mest Mk2, whilst in some ways you could say it's really good at showing you the flaws in the recording, it also detracts from the listening enjoyment. The U12T, on the other hand, tells me it's not a very good recording, but it doesn't make it hard to listen to. So with that in mind, let's keep moving through these examples and come back to Sink and Soon by Norah Jones. I immediately noticed that there was better tonality in the banjo off to the left of the soundstage, and that mandolin off to the right of soundstage was now a homogeneous sound consisting of both the texture of the strums and also the vibrations and the resonance of the instrument. The soundstage was much smaller, and in that regard, the Mest Mk2 walks all over the U12T in terms of soundstage, but the U12T was a coherent soundstage. Everything sounded like it belonged together, and there was still space between everything. It wasn't expansive and huge, but it was much, much more realistic. I also think it's interesting that I happened to notice the banjo specifically when I first listened to the beginning of Sink and Soon on the U12Ts, whereas with the Mest Mk2, there was so much going on in terms of different textures and different sounds that I actually didn't really even notice the banjo. I had to go back and listen to it again to hear what the banjo sounded like, because once again, all of these sounds are kind of pulled apart just a little bit too much. And that to me is the common thread running through all my experiences with the Mest Mk2, is that it's trying too hard and pulling everything apart just a little bit too much. But before we wrap up with any sort of conclusion, let me talk about Groove Me by King Floyd. On the U12T, this still had pretty harsh and nasty treble. As I said before, that's in the recording. It wasn't quite as bad on the U12T in terms of listenability, but it was still not a good recording and quite a harsh treble throughout. The imaging and focus on the U12T was nowhere near as sharp as it was from the Mest Mk2, but I certainly know which one I'd prefer to listen to, because the Mest Mk2 was trying to shred my ears with the treble from the recording, whereas the U12T kept it more under control. It does come at the expense of that really razor sharp focus, but that's not about the U12T being a subpar performer. I think it's about the Mest Mk2 actually overdoing it. In much the same way the HD800 and the HD800S have their party pieces in terms of the way they present the music at the expense of enjoyment in a lot of cases, the Mest Mk2 is doing similar things. It's kind of like they're a one-trick or maybe a two-trick pony, but those tricks happen at different times and at the expense of the rest of the experience. The U12T, on the other hand, does everything well. It does it in such a way that's not always exciting, but it's always consistent, true to source, and very, very revealing of what you're actually listening to. The final thing I'll mention about Groove Me by King Floyd is that the bass was much more consistent from the U12T, because unlike the bass that came and went from the Mest Mk2, the balanced armatures providing the bass from the U12T were consistent regardless of which note the bass player hit. So unlike the vibrations that were coming and going and therefore enhancing the bass or pulling back on the bass from the Mest Mk2, every note the bass player hit sounded consistent and the same, obviously at different notes, but in terms of the amount of bass delivered and the tonal qualities of that bass, they were all consistent regardless of the note. So as you've probably gathered by now, I'm not particularly sold on the Mest Mk2. It's not an IEM that I'm going to be upset to send back to Ben. I really appreciate him sending them to me. I was really interested to hear them, having had a soft spot for Unique Melody from my original Miracle days, but I haven't particularly enjoyed my time with them. I think the quadbrid technology is a wonderful idea, but I just think it's a very, very difficult thing to implement effectively. You've got 4 different driver types with 4 different inherent tonalities. And whilst a hybrid using a dynamic driver and balanced armatures can work beautifully, and by all accounts, things like the Clairvoyance and the Monarch that I'm trying to get a review for, so bear with me and please don't bother asking me in the comment, I'm already trying. I believe that those sorts of mixtures of drivers can sometimes work, but I think it's just gone a step too far here. Maybe the bone conduction driver is the thing taking it a step too far. Maybe it's their implementation, and an implementation done by somebody else in a different way could actually work. But I think the Mest Mk2 is just trying a bit too hard and not quite succeeding as a result. They've overreached, and I think they've stumbled a bit. I think the Mest Mk2 is a very interesting sonic experience. They're not a bad thing to listen to, they're not horrible or unenjoyable, and as I've already said, there will be moments where they'll hit a point of magic and everything comes together and they're spectacular, but for me, across my whole music collection, those moments were very few and far between. I might have had 1 or 2 of those moments in the day or 2 that I spent listening to these before I sat down to take my notes. So it's really not an IEM that I can recommend, other than a point of curiosity and something to try out if you're so inclined to hear what the quadbrid style or technology is all about. Now obviously I'm talking about a $1,500 earphone. That's not probably something most people are going to buy out of pure curiosity. So I'd have to say that if you're in the market for an earphone at this price level and you can afford to spend a bit more, just go straight for the U12T and don't ever look back. I wrote to Ben after having a listen to these and said that I feel no buyer's remorse about buying the U12T, even having listened to these. Yes, they're amazing technology, they're beautifully made, beautifully packaged, a lot about them you can like, but when it comes to the musical enjoyment, they just fall short because of that lack of coherency on so many tracks. So I'm sorry that I couldn't provide better news on these. I don't think they're a worthwhile investment. I do think you can spend $1,500 much better, such as the 64 Audio U12T, if you're able to buy them either second hand, or you can save a bit more money and buy them at full price, which they're about $500 more. It's a very worthwhile investment. No doubt there are plenty of other IEMs in this same price point that you'd love me to review alongside these, but as always I can only work with what I have here, so hopefully I've been able to paint enough of a picture of these that you've got a good sense of them, even without direct comparisons to other equally priced IEMs. Hopefully you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and the subscribe button so I can share more content with you in the future. Once again, I want to say a huge thank you to Ben Engineer over on StereoNet, and for now I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.